Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the March. Nancy J. Bissett, the restoration ecologist, botanist, and horticulturalist. She's co-owner of the Native Thing, a company specializing in restoration of upland communities, and a nursery growing only Florida native plants since 1982. As the developer of the Natives Nursery, Nancy has experimented with the propagation and growth of many native plants, including grasses, wildflowers, and rare species. She has also developed techniques for restoring many upland communities, including scrub, sandhill, and flatwoods, that include planting, direct seeding, native ground covers, and weed control. As a botanist, she has helped federal, state, and local authorities find and evaluate rare plant communities and has found new rare plant locations, a new scrub mint, and a new Carphephorus called Pineland Purple. Without further ado, please welcome Nancy Bissett.
You can just click on those lights. They're on it right now. So you can click through. Oh, I guess you have to actually hit this. No. Come on. Let me see if I can move this 1 second.
Where's the? Right
There we go.
I just pressed that for forward.
Yep. Just
How
kind
do I
of
get
tap
that?
right here.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you just kind of tap the.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So though we have done, well, I should back up a bit. We do have a retail nursery too, and we brought some retail lists, and I just have to warn you, we're really only open on Thursdays until 3 o'clock because my daughter Sarah, who manages the nursery, manages a family and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's the only time she can really do it. I know it's not the most convenient, but there you go. So I have, though I've restored or worked on restoring a lot of areas that are behind lock gates, etc. This one is a very public restoration in a sense, and is creating wild gardens at October Gardens and what has happened to them. So here is a preview of what it was. The sandhill actually extends up off to the right into their natural sandhill. So the idea was for it to be an extension down into the garden. And we also created a wet prairie, bog garden, and a flatwoods. I should say attempt. So sandhills, I think most of you are familiar with them. Here's an example from Bachtaler Gardens and one from Tall Timbers. And you see that the major ground cover structure is really grasses. And the same is true of wet prairie, even though the basic structure may be more sedges. Very diverse ecosystem. And there you see an example of the many sedges that dominate it. And then we get into the beautiful bogs, especially from the Florida Panhandle, with the many pitcher plants. Some of the plants were difficult to include and establish, and others were very easy. I didn't even attempt orchids, however. The pitcher plants were kind of a surprise. I had difficulty finding non-hybridized cultivars of pitcher plants. We tried growing a bunch. They're extremely slow growing. We were able to get a bunch of donations actually from the Atlanta Botanic Gardens. So again, sedges are the structure of most bog areas as well as wet prairies. Like the beak sedges in Costa Chattanooga, And an example of flatwoods, a bit wetter than sandhill, but again, abundant with grasses and wildflowers. And of course, most of these systems have scattered trees, but they are basically ground cover systems. So the sandhill, before we started, was a bahia grass area, but then all of the equipment for expanding the gardens, the trucks, the trailers, etc., were parked on it. And that caused a few introductions. We did have it scraped ahead of time, but even then, there were remnants of things we didn't want. For the wet prairie, the windows on the pond was scraped to sort of refresh it. So that's where the yellow sand came from, a clayey sand. But on top of that, we put 12 inches of a mix of sand and peat. And the wetland, which we were not really part of constructing, was a filter system for the windows on the pond. And it had a type of gravel through it, and the water was pumped from the pond up to the back end and then flowed back on down through. And so here you can't even really see it, but it flowed under the boardwalk. And there's an example of windows on the pond after planting, and of course showing muhly grass. The bog has a plastic liner covered with 4 parts peat and 1 part sand. And the plastic liner is 12 inches below the lip. And so water would seep out after the rain. And what they have done, best way we found to control water is actually by hose, which is somewhat disguised. And then when it dries out, they fill it up again. So it really hasn't been subject to like 12 inches of water in all this time. I also add here, we did 4 parts peat to 1 part sand. I think that was excessive. I would definitely reduce that. And if I ever have the chance to do it again. Pardon? I would reduce the peat. So it'd be more like 1 to 1, something on that order. Seed, for the most part, we hand collected and grew out the plants from seed from natural areas. We also had problems with the very slow growing beak sedges, which surprised me. So we ended up actually getting permission from the site we normally harvest seed from to dig small plants. And that worked quite well for our wet prairie and beak sedge trees. Well, that harvested seed was spread after planting the sandhill, again, in an attempt to reduce or give competition right away to weeds. It was mixed with hand harvested seed like we do for all of our seeding projects. It's quite a process. We have the machine harvested seed. We have a crew that goes out and collects by hand. By the way, that is the high point of our workers each year, is being able to get out into these beautiful sites and collect seed. The plants were all grown, grasses and tubulings, and the wildflowers in quartz. We planted actually 2 grasses for every wildflower for the sandhill and flatwoods and the wet prairie, what was sedges mostly. So here's a layout for the bog plants, and you can see kind of did patterns to give clusters of plants. Needless to say, that was another high point of our crew, being able to work at Bachtaler Gardens. We did try putting sphagnum moss in the bog garden. I don't think it did a whole lot of good. And all of our holes were dug with augers, which to us gives us a really good planting hole and easy to tuck in around. And they were all hand tucked. And here we are dispersing plants on the sandhill area. I mentioned that we put seed in between the plants in the sandhill. I was hoping that it would reduce weed pressure. I don't really have any feedback on that. I don't know if it was worthwhile or not. As I said before, the sandhill was a continuation up into the naturally existing sandhill. And so with the installation of the new walkway, we planted from the walkway up towards the existing sandhill in, a good 10 feet wherever it was needed. So it was a blend. Those of you who know David Price, who's in charge, the president of Tower Gardens, he's also an artist and takes a very artistic view towards the gardens. So one of his goals was to add things like interesting fallen logs. So here I did mention 2 grasses are planted for each wildflower. And here's some of the diversity with wiregrass, love grasses, andropogons, Banthus, and split-beard bluestem, green eyes, blazing stars, love grasses, lopsided Indian grass, red sage. Lopsided Indian grass, of course, bloomed beautifully that first year, and well, second year and third year. And we use the love grasses for a couple of reasons. The Elliott's love grass is more persistent than the purple, but it also gives that bluish contrast in the landscape. Beyond that, the love grasses occupy space very well that might be occupied by less desirable things like really looking weedy things. And over time, with the establishment of the slower growing wiregrass, they do get outcompeted. It didn't happen here, and I'll explain why. But this is what I've seen in seeded areas that we've done in the past. So it's kind of a temporary placeholder. And again, I have seen the Elliott's wiregrass, however, persisting in much smaller quantities in flatwoods, etc. So there's quite a bloom of love. We really aimed for diversity. I wanted it to look like a sandhill. I've since been told that's really too hard for maintenance people to maintain. We'll get into that too. Here's summer farewell. And again, there's another Banthus. That's not a species we're usually able to get seed from to grow. Comelina, Mayflower. Paelophoxia. I really like the Paelophoxia and Tigrifolia, but we did plant both. 4 blazing star species, including Beatrice olingri, the rare scrub one. I must also admit that any of the rare plants that we planted were much less likely to survive in the long run. And not so rare perhaps, but the sandhill, I can't think of the common name, Asclepias humistata, the scrub milkweed, sandhill milkweed, which is really difficult to grow, but we grew a bunch of them. We planted out a bunch. Very few survived. It's just a really touchy plant. And Chapman's and evergreen blazing star, Beatrice livigata. One I really liked was the Androtina jucunda. It is phenomenal as a pollinator tractor. Super plant that way. And one of the resident gopher tortoises, he just moved in very happily from the sandhill. Saw him just the other day. Or his friend. In the flatwoods, we planted 20 different species. It's a fairly small area too. The starry rosin weed, Silphium astericus, I think is just a super wildflower that keeps blooming year round if it's not freezing. And again, a terrific pollinator attractor. The flatwoods did not have any soil manipulation. The only difference is they were being watered with the regular gardens. And so it received more water that way. We still had to keep sandy soil. Looking at it recently, I realized that the whole area was not being irrigated, only part of it. So that's one of the issues we're still addressing. Rayless sunflower again is represented there, and it's making nice big patches. The wet prairie had so many species, partly because of these little plants we dug, had other plants associated with them, and so the numbers just kept multiplying. We did plant the cardinal flower on that little waterway down to the windows in the pond. I saw it blooming recently. Carphephorus, Philiformis, which now has some other weird generic name. Anybody want to say it? No, I just saw it. Oh, no, not another one. Yeah. Sarracenia, yes. Some of the pitcher plants. And we planted quite a variety of pitcher plants originally. Giant white top sedge put on a magnificent show the first year. People would just come up there and look at it. And it too did not persist. I'm pretty sure the reason is, even though we picked the wettest part of what was created as a wet prairie, I don't think it was wet enough. So, you know, you make all these suppositions when you're planning, and they just don't always work out. So there's some of the other species that went in. Elytris in the bottom did quite well. The Rudbeckia, there is that red one from the Panhandle. Rudbeckia graminia and Marshallia. Oh, that's so beautiful. So, as I promised, life finds a way. So what happens when we plant an area and things change, and not always the way you expect? So I copied this out from Society of Ecological Restoration trajectory. Ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Of course, it was in this case. It is an intentional activity that initiates or accelerates an ecological pathway or trajectory through time towards a reference state. Briefly, it's a moving picture from the past, or we can project it into the future. In other words, if we did this or that, what would happen next? And to me, that is the big joy of restoration, is this problem solving. But on any scale, I think, even in a backyard or front yard or at city park, we need to think this through. So first of all, horror of vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. Aristotle talked about this way back when, Parmenides on nature. So what are these holes? We call them ecological niches. And we usually think about animals when we're thinking about ecological niches. And plant niches are often just thought of needing physical ground space. And that's a mental trap, because what is an ecological niche for a plant? Little history, G. Evelyn Hutchinson defined niche as n-dimensional hypervolume. And so look at all of these different factors that can give space for a plant. Light, hydrology, nutrients, soil, structure, climate, competitors, predators, mutualists, and on. So we think we have a full garden by planting, what, 16 inches apart or 18 inches apart? No, not necessarily. It's who gets there first and who lasts through time. I've been familiar with this floristic quality index by Gerald Willem, who thought this up in Chicago in, I think, the 1950s. And he developed a coefficient of conservatism for each species with grades from 0 to 10. And there's sort of a brief summary of what they are. I took that and modified it a bit for our work in restoration. And I looked at anything that was aggressive and exotic, weedy species, and I gave it 0. Native weedy species, 1 to 2. By the way, Coreopsis leavenworthii is a native weedy species. Beautiful. But Biden's elba, I would call that more pioneer. So pioneer species is what really tripped me up on this whole venture, because we had a, not completely, but fairly good control on the weedy species. But pioneer species that readily reseed or spread in unnatural or disturbed areas, but persist and are characteristic of mature ecosystems also. And when you put these into a garden setting, they can move out, take over. Yeah, I see head shaking there, yes. So some native plants can overwhelm the landscape. And when we dug those little bits of deep sedges, because we couldn't get them all grown, I was forever weeding out whatever else came up. And one of the things that I seemed to weed out more than anything else was the common broom sedge, Andropogon virginicus variety, virginicus, which is the weedy Andropogon. And so we had to come in, as you see in the bottom picture, we cut them off and we herbicided them. And there you can see where they've been chopped off a bit near the bog. The other plant, as a background, I planted Aster Eliadii, which is what, is whatever now. This is not from the gardens, this is from our neighborhood, which is where I got the seed. Anyhow, I had it planted as a very backdrop to the wet prairie. It has completely marched out and taken over big areas of the garden. It was not controlled as I had expected and told people to control it. But I think there was another issue. I think that there was not enough water put on the wet prairie. And so this plant just went on a rampage. So it's one of the things we're trying to figure out now. And then in the sandhill, there was not let's put it this way, a species got away from them. This happened fairly recently. And so there's this huge bare spot in the back where they just nuked everything. There's nothing left there. They're going to have to replant. And that was because whoever was in charge of the gardens, taking care of it at that time, let it get away from them. They didn't see what was going on. So we're going back to management issues. And really most disgusting of all, now this was part of the wetland that I told you about that had the gravel and so on in the base. Cogan grass is coming up all over. Now, in a public garden, you should not have cogan grass coming up. And it's not just there now, it's spreading out into the wet prairie. So they have some big problems to handle, and we're trying to figure out a way forward. I think perhaps the pandemic is part of the problem. You know, things sort of got left off to the side for a while. But I added this slide just as a thought. Maintenance is critical, and it's often the downfall of most of the wildflower gardens, I think. Wildflower and grass meadows are particularly vulnerable to change because they are seasonal, non-woody. And when I looked at the gardens recently, anything that was woody, it didn't matter if it was a big tree that didn't belong there, or palmetto or palm or whatever, it was left. But the essence of the garden was not. Okay. Moving by seed and rhizome, wildflowers do that quite readily, and grasses. They may be short-lived, and they're not always recognizable, which is a really big issue for maintenance people who are not familiar with the product. So I had some suggestions. This is beginning thought. We in the Florida Wildflower Foundation are really trying to tackle this issue, but we're just at the very beginning. Number one, written maintenance plan at the beginning with vision for what it should look like. Number two, read frequently that plan and follow by frequent observation by a supervisor who knows what it's supposed to look like. Understand what plants need to be controlled, especially pioneers, also weedies. Teach maintenance personnel specifically and frequently, maybe only 1 or 2 plants at a time so they can handle it until they become more familiar. Look out for creeping problems like that Aster eleatii, and use irrigation to establish the plants well to begin with, which I added because I think that was an issue at Bob Tower too. One of the things they did do is manage this area, the sandhill, with a wildfire. And that's what it looked like a little bit after the burn. Now I've just got a series of pictures on the garden growing up. Not too long after planting, starting to grow in quite well that summer, and blooming. I think there you see Penstemon multiflorus, which has been a really beautiful plant there, good performance. And those love grasses, which we talked about before. Here's another mystery. I planted 2 wiregrass for every other grass in the sandhill and the flatwoods, and I don't know what happened to them. So the love grasses have not diminished, but the wire grasses, which should have been the essence of those ecosystems, are not there. Hopefully it wasn't an untrained maintenance person who thought they were ugly and herbicide them. I don't know. They are slow growing. When we did our first restoration project for 176 acres at Reedy Creek Mitigation Bank, we followed the plants very closely, monitoring protocols. And I can tell you that for the first 5 years, every year, the mass, the area of the wiregrass increased. It's slow growing, but boy, is it persistent. So why it wasn't persistent here, don't know. And there's that beautiful big white top sedge initially. The ball garden and the wet prairie. And a good example again of the oxypolis. The elytras also did quite well, by the way. And Orangium yuccifolium. I don't know why, but they look like they're 5 times as big as they are in the wild. And here's looking down the boardwalk. The ball garden itself. With additional planted plants. And even the coreopsis, leavenworthii, getting a lot of color in the summer. And the flatwoods. The first, actually. It went a little. Okay. I was almost at the, wait a minute. Here we go. Take a walk on the wild side, build natural areas where people can immerse themselves in life. And that is the, just got lost momentarily.